What's going on, people? So, welcome to another SK Wealth Academy podcast. If you have not yet subscribed, please do subscribe below, hit the notification bell. Please do like and comment below. Let me know what you think about this video. So, today I'm going to talk about here's exactly what's wrong with the idea being spread by the mainstream media that China is the number one threat to freedom around the world. I know they say they're the number one threat to democracy around the world, but what they really mean is freedom, right? They want to fearmonger, get people afraid of China, and get people all around the world to support the Western narrative of going to war with China if that becomes what is necessary for the parasitic ruling class to continue their control over the citizenry of the world through their fiat currency banking system, which they're using the COVID-19 lockdowns to quickly migrate to a platform of 100% digital currency. Now, I'm going to tell you exactly what's wrong with that narrative and exactly what's wrong with all the people that believe that narrative. Now, before I know already that's going to offend some people. Some people are like, oh, this is going to be a pro-communist video or a pro-Putin video, because there's so many people that are so brainwashed into believing what they've been ordered to believe because they have zero critical thinking skills, that's the first thought that's going to go through their head. And they won't even understand why I say the narrative is China's the number one threat to freedom around the world, even though what's being said in mass media, China's the number one threat to democracy around the world, because they've never read like Plato's The Republic. They don't know the deep thinkers and philosophers, the greatest philosophers in the history, why they said that democracy was a form of governance favored by the parasitic ruling class to take their nations to tyranny. They wouldn't understand that at all. So if you do, and I'm assuming that 90% of people that watch my videos do, then hopefully you'll understand exactly what I am going to say, because this is going to be a super important video, and perhaps it will even help those of you that get so frustrated with all your friends and your family members and people you feel are brainwashed, that can't think for themselves, are literally incapable of forming an independent thought without being ordered by Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or Google when they search Google, because you hear so many people still say, hey, what's the answer? Oh, Google this. Like they think Google's some kind of unbiased search engine. Like my mind is blown that people don't understand, how their belief system is being 100% controlled by the parasitic ruling class, and where their entire brains emptied out of the belief system that has been put there by the parasitic ruling class, you probably wouldn't find anything inside their heads. So for those of you that have been following me since the 2008 global financial crisis, you know that back in 2012, more than 8 years ago, I wrote an article, and I'll put a link in the show notes below, regarding banker speak. I said, this is how you understand what bankers really mean. And then I put a bunch of banking terms that are used by the mass media and what they really mean. So I'll just go through some really quickly. Like US Federal Reserve equals European controlled private central bank. Central bank equals counterfeiting ringleader. Criminal underworld currency counterfeiters, competitors that must be arrested by the parasitic ruling class and jailed. Savings account, devaluation account or cash advance for gambling. Gambling, banking primary business line. Fraud, banking secondary business line. Las Vegas, Macau, Atlantic City, model for running business operations. Inflation, currency devaluation of purchasing power through anti-free market manipulation of interest rates by the most powerful private bank in your country. Fractional reserve system, fractional expansion citizen bankruptcy system, or for short BSC, biggest scam ever. Futures markets, manipulation casino, or Skynet operated 3-card Monte scam. Pablo Escobar, El Chapo Guzman, the Ochoa Hermanos, Yakuza, Sinaloa drug cartel, equals cash cows to bankers. Independent media, terrorist for telling the truth about global banking. Mass media, allies, and puppets, controlled by the puppet masters. So again, that was just a partial list of the banking glossary that I put together 8 years ago to help people understand bankers speak. And this is, it's not like this only started 8 years ago. Obviously, this has been around forever. In politics, for example, in 2003, the George W. Bush administration, or was it the 2003? I think it was George. I think it was W. who was president, because the first invasions of Iraq happened under his father in the 1990s. So, or was that early 2000? My timeline's all messed up. And anyways, it was a Bush that passed the Clean Air Act in August of 2003. You know what the Clean Air Act, okay? Again, it's the whole Orwellian 1984 doublespeak. You would think that's to improve the quality of air in America. Now, it was actually that act, if you read the passage, was to allow corporations more credits to pollute the air further. So actually gave them more leeway. If they would just update their technology, then they could dump all the pollutants they wanted into the air. So again, in bank speak, the Chinese threat to democracy, what that really means, which the bankers and the political parasitic ruling class are trying to sell to all of us as the biggest threat to democracy in the entire world, is really what that means is it's the biggest economic threat to the US and UK economic empires. Now, I've read a lot of history books over time. Doesn't mean I'm always right, but it does mean that my opinion has the necessary historical and factual foundation to be 1,000 times more valid than all these chimpanzee spouting nationalists out there that have never read a history book in their entire lives, and like I said, are being force fed like geese whose livers are being fattened for skwa. They're being force fed information, and their entire belief system is being force fed, but they're just these chimpanzees, these nationalistic chimpanzees are just too ignorant and dumb to recognize that. So, for example, in 1954, the U.S. government overthrew the democratically elected Guatemalan government for the benefit of the United Fruit Company. Again, all economics, all follow the money trail. Like if you really want to know what happened on 9/11, follow the money trail as well. And then not within that same year or same time frame, I think it was 1953, or maybe it was that same year, 1954. Again, the CIA overthrew democratically Iranian leader Mossadegh. Again, why was that done? That was done because Mossadegh had started nationalizing oil interests in Iran. British Petroleum was very unhappy, and so for the sake of protecting Western economic interests, not only did the CIA oust a democratically elected leader, which would be one of the biggest threats to democracy in the world when you're actually implementing regime change, kicking out democratically elected leaders in Guatemala, in Iran, and also at that time Mossadegh was implementing a very secular Islamic state. So for all the chimpanzees, again, they say, oh, look at Iran, Iran's so repressive. You know why they have a repressive regime right now? It's because of your so-called favorite U.S. democratic leaders overthrowing democracies, overthrowing very secular Islamic states where women actually had rights. Women could dress any way they wanted. They didn't have to wear a burqa. You know, they weren't forced to dress in a certain way. And it's because of Western meddling, overthrowing democratically elected leaders in that state. So if you're someone that buys into this China's the greatest threat to global democracy bunk, then you're exactly the kind of person that helped turn Iran from a relatively free state to the much more repressive state it is today, the much more militant Islamic state it is today, and probably are just too dumb to understand this and would rail against the repression in Iran today, not understanding how your own leaders and the own nations in which you live in helped create these states of repression. Now, China, like I said a million times too, I probably wouldn't be welcome in China because I've made so many videos in which I have said how repressive their surveillance is, how they control their citizens in repressive manners at times. So like for those, again, that always I've talked about how one of the most effective ways to dumb down people is to put people on a binary track. Oh, you're saying China's not this evil demon that we say it is, so you must love China, you must love communists. That's what people are so stupid. They buy into this binary model that the parasitic ruling class has set up to try to divide and conquer us. So they don't realize they're being pawns used to lead the rest of their citizens into checkmate. And they're being controlled like marionettes by the leaders of their nations. And just like non-thinking pods to do exactly what, in fact, they're working against the best interests of humanity. So if you believe it, you're working against the best interests of humanity. So look at how much suppression of free speech and liberty is going on in the world right now. Who are the worst countries in response to the COVID crisis? Australia, I would say, is by far the worst. Some states, not all, some states in the United States, like New York and California, have been really repressive. Some states in Canada as well, these so-called bastions of liberty, right? What is sold to the rest of the world as bastions of liberty are doing far more oppressive things than nations in which those citizens typically think of as being oppressive and repressive. So the next thing I want to move on to, I'm going to actually get into banking criminality. That's the greatest threat to democracy that actually exists far more in Western nations than in China. And also, I'm going to discuss right now other nations in Asia that are really a greater threat to democracy and freedoms than China by far, like some of the things they've done. But guess what? They're not a greater threat to the economic hegemony of Western nations. So that's why they are not being demonized like China. And in fact, Western nations leaders have not even called out the horrific repugnancy of a lot of this just mind-blowing immorality that's going on in other Asian nations, which is so hypocritical because if you look at their demonization of China as the greatest threat to democracy, really. So they're just going to overlook slavery. They're going to overlook genocide happening in other Asian nations. So never call this stuff out once. Not one. I'm going to tell you why they don't call it out right now. So this is why I'm saying that anyone that buys into this narrative as China is the #1 threat to freedom in the world, you're being a pawn being used to actually oppress humanity and liberty all over the world because you're not providing a fair and balanced view of what is really reality in this world. So let's look at genocide being endorsed in Kashmir by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Let's look at the genocide of the Rohingya population, minority Rohingya population in Myanmar. But guess what? U.S. wants access to newly opened up Myanmar markets. And Western companies like Coca-Cola are making lots and lots of profits now. So they don't want to upset the big corporations by condemning genocide. So Obama didn't do it. Trump didn't speak out against genocide in Myanmar. So U.S. central bankers have actually captured as well the direction of the Reserve Bank of India. We could see that with the demonetization efforts forwarded by Prime Minister Narendra Modi towards gold in India, trying to rob poor Indian citizens of the only sound money they have, gold, and give them worthless devaluing rupees in return. So now that the European central bankers that control the U.S. central bank, or U.S. central banking families that control the U.S. central bank, have instituted pro-U.S. dollar policy in the Reserve Bank of India, no U.S. politician will speak out against the genocide the Indian PM is aggressively forwarding right now in Kashmir. And there's literally, like I said, slave labor being used by more than one Southeast Asian nation. And this is not even the worst. I'm getting to the worst possible part of this all the anti-democracy things happening in Asian nations are worse than what's happening in China. So literal slavery is happening. Of course, CNN, a US media firm, tries to cover it up by calling it, they actually, I'm going to put a link in the article below so you can show like how the journalists that work for CNN are so repugnant morally. They would call slavery labor abuses. You know, they always find some kind of way to tone down the horrific nature of what is really happening. But they're literally slaves, meaning people that don't get paid, they're out at sea. They were actually recruited with promises of a lot of money. So they came from other countries to work in these South Asian shipping boats. They're out at sea. They don't return to docks. They're not allowed when they come back and bring their haul to step foot on land. Their passports have been taken away. If they don't listen to their slave master ship captains, they're literally either hacked to death and dumped in the ocean, heads cut off, shot in the head and dumped in the ocean. And this is happening. And guess what? All US politicians know this. And who are they speaking out against is the most not these nations that are basically engaging in slavery and have been for years. You know why? Again, because, hey, Nestle uses some of these companies that engage in slavery to source their seafood. I'll put the links again in the show notes below. So you have no US president, no UK prime minister, no parliament member, no congressman, you know, literally maybe not none, maybe there's one or two, but it hasn't been, they haven't as a group or as a national leader, any of them spoke out against any of this in the same manner in which they've spoken out and tried to demonize China. And this is about like I said, this is even the worst of what's happening. So again, just think about what I'm going to say for a second, okay? If Western citizens that think China is enemy number one. If you're watching this right now and you think China's enemy number one, if you never watched, think about this, what I'm going to ask you. If you never watch any mass media, if you never logged on to Facebook, if you never watched your mass media channels like CNN, MSNBC, if you didn't log in to use Google to search for your answers, you didn't watch your mass media, would you think China is the number one enemy to democracy right now? Because just think, what did you believe 10 years ago? Did you think China was the number one enemy to democracy 10 years ago? Because this wasn't the narrative, or maybe you have to go back to like 15 years ago, whenever it wasn't happening. Did you think that China was the number one enemy to democracy? Because basically, not much has changed as far as the governance in China. The CCP is still in control. So think about that. If you didn't, then you should 100% realize you're being brainwashed to adopt a narrative that the parasitic ruling class wants you to adopt. Because I guarantee you, if you watch all the same media channels now that put all those thoughts in your head, and if they said the same things about Singapore instead of China, you'd be watching this right now saying, oh my God, Singapore is so evil. They're the number one enemy to democracy. That's 100% fact. And if that applies to you, that hopefully doesn't apply to any of you, but if that applies to you, think if you didn't know about all these other repugnant, morally worse acts that I just told you that threaten democracy to a much greater nation that all these other nations in Asia are engaging in. There's a reason for that. Because I'm sure that since rampant poverty exists all throughout Southeast Asia, that, in fact, I know it is. This is the worst thing that's happening, because in response to these economic lockdowns that are totally unnecessary. It's all done for compliance and obedience to make sure that the nationalist chimpanzees incapable of thinking for themselves will continue to think that we should go to war with China, that they're the biggest enemy to democracy, when other nations that aren't a bigger threat economically to Western interests, so that's why they're not being demonized, but are certainly committing worse acts against democracy than even China at this point in time, but are given a free pass by Western leaders because there's Western economic interests to protect in these countries in which horrible, horrific things are being done. This is the number one horrific thing. Human trafficking and child sex trafficking is exploding now in Southeast Asia and in other in other poor nations around the world. And I guarantee you that all Western nations leaders know about this because they're taught about this in daily security briefings. And in fact, it's even the US government releases an annual trafficking report, which assesses the level of tracking, and the worst is tier 2 and tier 3. And they categorize almost every single Southeast Asian country as a tier 2 or tier 3 for human trafficking and child sex trafficking. So again, like even right now, like during the lockdowns, right? 100,000 jobs have been lost in Cambodia's garment sector alone, right? So these nations that would typically engage in human trafficking, child sex trafficking, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Philippines, a lot of these Southeast Asian countries, right? The government's providing almost no assistance, even though the government is corrupt as hell in Cambodia because they're charging any foreigner any traveler that comes into the country $2,000 to $3,000 just to enter. I mean, there's conditions where they say they could refund you that money, but we need this to test you and put you in a hospital and quarantine you. Basically, everyone's going to get quarantined. So they're charging, but they're not using any of that money to help all the people that lost their jobs. And you know what happens? People get desperate. Not only that, they're forced to take out loans, and because they don't have anything to give in collateral. As collateral for these, basically loans are given at 30-40% annual interest rates. They take their children as collateral and then they traffic them out to pedophiles. So all you idiots out there that don't understand the lack of science behind the lockdowns, let me tell you the stats that the CDC just released, okay? Because we already know, number one, this is a fact, the mortality statistics released by the CDC are inaccurately biased to the highest death rates possible. So they're not even accurate, right? So what I'm going to tell you is even inaccurate, and they should be much lower, because we know that because of lack of accuracy in the methodology used to categorize a death due to the virus in America, that the numbers have all been skewed unrealistically higher, scientifically significantly higher. Now this is what they say is the probability of survival from this. This is come from the CDC. These are the biased to as much death as possible statistics they just released from 0 to 19. Okay, all colleges are shut down. Like I graduated at age 20, so this is like college and high school, middle school, grade school. All these schools have been closed down. Your probabilities of dying if you get coronavirus is 0.003%. In other words, probability of survival, let me just give that, is 99.997%. Does that sound like a lethal virus? If you're 20 to 49 years of age, probability of survival, it drops down slightly because getting older now, you're not a teen anymore, 99.98%. If you're 50 to 69, still 99.5%. Only when you get to 70 and above does it drop down to 94.6% and become more serious. And these are the mortality rates or survival rates, right? Because mortality you just subtract from 100% that the CDC released. And we know that these survival rates are even higher because, as I told you, everything that that's been collected in America as far as deaths related to corona has been skewed inaccurately higher. So that's crazy. And so again, if you've never spent more than 5 minutes independently researching why you believe you should be locked down, but all your opinion is sourced just from either social media or mass media, and you support the lockdowns because you selfishly and narcissistically only think about yourself and not literally the billions of lives that is ruining around the world, the hundreds of thousands of kids that are now being sex trafficked because, and then some parents, this is horrific, will willingly do it because they're starving to death now. That's the only way they have to make money, is to sex traffic their own 12, 13-year-old kids. Or if you only support lockdowns because you're lazy, you want to suck at the government's teeth for as long as possible, to get a few $1,000s a month. You'd rather sit on your fat ass eating donuts and Doritos and watching cuties on Netflix all day. You're exactly the problem. You're the people that will ensure liberty will get crushed. You're the people for whom I have no respect. Or if you tell me you still support these draconian economic lockdowns and you've researched the topic, but in reality you haven't, you just say that to make yourself feel better, because I've encountered those people too. So I said, okay, tell me the independent studies you researched that you still believe we should all be economically locked down, because there's real science behind the lockdowns. Because if I research it and there's real science and behind the lockdowns and this virus was really deadly and I believe that science backed that, I would be for the lockdowns, but it doesn't. It doesn't. And so I've asked some people and then they just stutter because they just made that up to make themselves feel better. They've actually never independently researched and just lied to me and said, oh, I've looked at all the independent research and it's still, I still really support these lockdowns. I have no respect for you either. But I do respect those that have actually spent time, independently researched it, and you still believe we should be locked down. I respect for you, but I still believe you're ignorant and very misinformed about reality. And again, I'll put all the links below of everything I just talked about how there's slavery going on, increased sex trafficking because of these economic lockdowns, the higher, the almost zero mortality rate if you're under 70, even in the United States, that the United States Centers for Disease Control just released. Now, let's move on to banking, okay? Because I'm going to talk about, again, people say China is the biggest. I'm going to talk about some of the FinCEN results, okay? So that's the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and they just released some leaked documents came out to show how repugnant and anti-democratic practices are of the big global banks, all Western again, HSBC, JP Morgan, Standard Chartered, supporting terrorist groups, supporting the most violent narco groups in the world, like the Sinaloa drug cartel. Now, China has a different policy. They'll execute you immediately if you're found doing anything. Like, you know how many bankers from JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, Standard Chartered, like the worst offenders would have been executed if they had done this in China? All of them. Because China executed a former state banker for embezzlement, just for embezzlement and accepting bribes. And what was his crime? This real estate tycoon that was put to jail. But I know they've executed bankers. I've read that, but I'll put the link to this real estate tycoon who they, because he raised $800 million, 5.5 billion yuan, was equivalent of about $800 million. On total fraud. So basically, he was selling his services by producing false financial statements that concealed continuing losses, said they're so profitable and was able to raise all this money and stole $800 million from the public. Who does this sound like? This sounds exactly, and this guy was executed by China. This sounds exactly like, who is that Stanford? They said she was the new Steve Jobs because at one point her wealth, based upon totally fraudulent valuation of stock in her company, was like over $3 or $4 billion. What was her name? I can't remember, because she always dressed like in a black turtleneck like Steve Jobs. And anyways, it was a Stanford woman. Her name is slipping. And the company too is slipping. Okay. Well, I'll find it put in the show notes. But some of you probably know what I'm talking about. I don't know, I've been in a purple haze since being in the 6 months of travel lockdown. So things I normally can remember because I can see her face, just can't remember her name. She basically ran this fraud. She raised $900 million, more than 900. I think she was in the billions, but she lost $900 million of investable capital with a blood testing startup. She said she could take microdoses of blood and test. So you wouldn't have to take like a certain vial. So they could be home testing. You could run just with a finger pinprick and get the blood, send it to her labs, and they could give you full blood workups. So she lied, and so far, you know what's happened to her? Definitely would have been executed in China already, but she's awaiting trial has only been fined $500,000. She sold $900 million from people. Only fined, going on about the worst things again that are happening in Asia, right? That involve, again, Western corporations, so they're protected. Just demonize China's evil. They don't speak about Malaysia. You know why? Because Malaysia is probably even more corrupt than China, but Malaysia doesn't present an economic threat to the U.S. and the U.K. So they're never demonized as being so corrupt, even though they are, because they had a prime minister. I think it's still the same prime minister in power, Najib Razak, who took $681 million from the House of Saud, the royal Saudi Arabian family. And he says it was not a bribe, it was a gift. It's not a bribe, like they would just gift out of the beneficence of their heart $680 million to the prime minister. I don't even know if he's forced to give it back. How is that? I'm not really sure what happened. You can go look it up. But then there's another guy, Joe Low. He laundered $1 billion through the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund, right? You know who helped them? JP Morgan bankers helped them. So that's why they don't, demonize Malaysia, because there's Western banking interests making tons of money off of these corruption in these Asian countries, but they can't make it off of corruption in China, because if they were to go and arrested, then they would get executed. But they're happy to use and the other Asian nations that surround China as their playground for criminal activity. But they're never demonized by our president. They're never demonized by our congressman. They're never demonized by the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. They're never demonized by MPs, members of parliament in the UK. And even in Afghanistan, we'll go to war to secure your economic interests, because there was a JP Morgan banker, again, Ian Hanam, who was trying to finance the development of, guess what, $1 trillion of copper, gold, rare earth metals like lithium, platinum. And he was arrested for insider trading and fined nearly $750,000 by the UK Financial Services Authority years ago. But guess what? He's just arrested. But come back to finance, because you're a good criminal. So you could help us out. Now, even though he was fined for insider trading, and this was actually in Iraq, because he had inside information about the oil projects in Iraq that people were investing in. He could make a grip load of money for stealing Iraqi oil. That he is now the founder of this merchant bank in London, Hanam and Partners, that are trying, I believe Hanam and Partners are now involved to try to develop like the $1 trillion mineral reserve in Afghanistan, because a U.S. Geological Survey identified $1 trillion of gold, silver, platinum, and rare earth metals like lithium. And okay, when I said the FinCEN files, right? FinCEN stands for like Financial Crime Enforcement Network. There were some documents that were leaked at the end of September, and they represented about 2,000 SARS reports, not SARS the virus, but SARS or suspicious activity reports, right? 2,000 that represented an estimated $1 trillion of money laundered through the Western banking system. And according to an investigator that looked at these documents, because you can go find them online if you want, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network is a regulatory arm of the U.S. Treasury. But it's a joke, because they don't enforce crime. They just aid and abet crime. They said that they only represented, right, this 2,000 reports that people went through about suspicious activity representing $2 trillion of laundered money, only represented 0.2% of all the suspicious activity reports. So of that 2,000, that meant there was 1 million suspicious activity reports filed just in 6 years, between 2011 and 2017. It could be 7, but 6 or 7 years. There's over 1 million suspicious activity reports of money laundering filed by these banks, but with no follow-up by these regulatory agencies, no arrests, no executions, just carry on, because We know the banking system's been set up for this systemic criminal activity that you're doing. And then that since that involved $2 trillion of illegally laundered money and moved money for terrorists, like I said, some of the worst people in the entire world that present a much worse threat to democracy than China ever does, because these are bankers at Western banks. I know it's called HSBC, Hong Kong, Shanghai, but no, the corporate headquarters is in London. It's always been a British bank. It was formed as a drug money laundering bank to launder money from the opium trade during the opium wars in Hong Kong and China. So HSBC was formed as a drug money laundering bank. To this day, still doing it, but it's gone ham. It's gone even worse in laundering money for even worse people than the opium traders back then, because they've been found guilty of laundering money for Sinaloa. Sinaloa was one of the biggest drug cartels in Mexico, one of the most repugnantly, morally violent cartels that would behead people, dozens of people, hanging them upside down, headless bodies from overpasses as warnings on the most heavily trafficked, traveled routes in Mexico over freeways, so everyone would see and be afraid of them. But these are the kind of people that bankers say it's okay to do business with. And so, and for people that think I'm being hyperbolic when I say if you work for these banks, you're supporting terrorism, you're supporting the most repugnant, moral people in the world. Terrorists don't think for a second about strapping on a suicide vest and setting it off and killing dozens of innocent people. And by the way, I was in Bali, I think it's like over a decade ago, on the very street a suicide bomber detonated a suicide vest. I just left a few hours before it happened. So perhaps I missed death by a few hours. And I told bankers I knew back then, hey, that were working for clearly criminal organizations like JP Morgan, HSBC, Goldman Sachs, that, hey, you're fighting freedom by working for these banks. And you're supporting the very people, because your bank is doing business with people that get their funding through money laundered through banks like yours. You're funding the very people that might have killed me, like in Bali. And they just laugh. They say, oh, you haven't listened to our CEO. Our CEO, Stuart Gulliver, said he didn't know anything about this. And I don't know if they're actually that stupid to actually believe that, or that's what they have to tell themselves to keep working at a morally repugnant corporation. Because every single drug enforcement agency that investigated HSBC said it was literally impossible for top-ranking officials like Stuart Gulliver at HSBC not to know what they were doing. It was literally impossible. So I told bankers that worked at JP Morgan that by working for them, you're supporting terrorism, possibly even terrorist organizations that would bomb the United States again. And again, they laughed. They quoted Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon, look at, he's a great leader, because look at what he said. It's not, he was trying to be like Martin Luther King Jr. by making this like, statement of how he was such an upstanding person, even though he's a total snake. And he was saying, hey, every organization and person makes mistakes. I've made mistakes leading JP Morgan, and we've committed crimes, but it's not the mark of a great organization as far as like if you made a mistake. It's how quickly and strongly you lead an organization to clean it up. And Vincent just revealed, he said that after the 2008 global financial crisis, and dumbasses believed him that work for JP Morgan, say, look at our great leader, Jamie Dimon. He's saying he's going to clean up all the criminality. So how can you still come hard after my bank and that I work for? They said it was a complete joke. The regulator says it's a complete joke, that JP Morgan was one of the worst repeat offenders in committing criminality since 2008. They said they often have business dealings with companies dealing with North Korea and other nations outside of North Korea listed as fostering and developing terrorism. This is JP Morgan in there. And not only that, JP Morgan, they've always been repugnant. They identified that Bernie Madoff was a crook, and they pulled all their own corporate money out of the management of Bernie Madoff, but they didn't tell any of their clients that would continue to do business with Bernie Madoff, hey, we see some things wrong with Madoff, so we're going to pull all our corporate money out under his management, but you continue to do business with him. You know why? Because they made nearly $500 million of profit from servicing their client accounts that were still doing business with Bernie Madoff. So these are the kinds of people that and institutions that we never go after, but it's always just China, China, China. And honestly, China doesn't do things. They have done a lot of things I disagree with. I think are repressive. All I'm saying is, if you don't clean up your own house, how are you going to expect to try to clean up someone else's house? If you are so ignorant and so morally deficient, you will not clean up your own house. Not only will you not clean it up, you won't even acknowledge it, because most people won't acknowledge their own nations have problems far worse than even what's happening in China. They won't acknowledge it. They won't acknowledge the human trafficking rings, the sex trafficking rings, the systemic criminality of all the banks running in their nation, and the fact that their leaders do nothing about it. They won't acknowledge this. Standard Chartered, which operates primarily in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, help move funds for Dubai company that had ties to the Taliban. And like I said, when I say JP Morgan, Bank of New York Mellon also do business with documented terrorist groups, they weren't necessarily found guilty of moving money for the Taliban, but they moved hundreds of millions of dollars, like I said, with companies tied to North Korea. So again, by saying the biggest threat by far to democracy is the CCP. Even Steve Bannon, who once I defended several months ago, but he's been, because he would always say these things that sounded good. He said, I don't have any problem with the Chinese people. He's like, I love the Chinese people, but it's just the government. And he fooled me for a second, because what he's really doing, he's warmongering against all of China. He's just trying to say this nice thing that I'm not really against Chinese people, I'm just against the CCP. But yet recent studies, and I'll put them below again, that were conducted among 32,000 individuals between 2003 and 2016. So this is a course over 14 years, said 96% of respondents were either relatively satisfied or highly satisfied with the CCP. So almost billions of Chinese people support the CCP. So if you're saying the CCP is evil, Steve Bannon, you're saying all the Chinese people are evil. Now, why would they say that? Why would they say they support the CCP? Because number one, I spent a couple months in Beijing and in Shanghai. I've spoken to enough locals. I have friends that still live in Shanghai to guarantee you people are not saying this. This is the Western view. Oh, they're just being intimidated. They would not dare say that they don't support the CCP. That's not what's going on. Because I've been there and I've lived there. And again, idiot chimpanzee nationalists try to tell me like it is what's really going on there that have never set foot inside China. And they want to argue with people that have friends that have been living there their entire lives that tell me what it is like. And I've witnessed and observed from my own eyes on months of staying there, that this high level of satisfaction comes from the fact that the CCP has brought literally hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So they say, okay, that's a trade-off. You're going to surveil us. You're going to restrict some of our freedoms this way. We're fine with that. You brought us out of poverty. That's what it has to do. It has to do with economics. That's why across the board, almost 100% of their citizens support the CCP. It has to do with the fact that their government brought them out of poverty into the middle class. So it's so disingenuous of Steve Bannon, as well as this other journalist, Simone Gao, that I used to support too, but she's always just like, China's the devil, China's the devil, China's the devil. It's like Steve Bannon, to imply that Chinese always live in fear and hate of the government. That's not true at all. So again, let me see if there's anything else, because I'm pretty much getting ready to wrap up this particular podcast. The really interesting thing to me about China and America is that in many ways things are very similar. Like for the state of surveillance, right? It's very, very similar between the two nations. But the difference is, in China, everyone knows it. If you cross the street and jaywalk, by the time you finish crossing the street on WeChat or Weibo, whatever social media platform you're attached to, you'll get a ding and you'll get a fine, because there's CCTV cameras like everywhere. And so people understand that. But I also find it very interesting that people in China, the dozens of locals I talked to when I was there, who are the friends of my friends that live there, are actually much more aware of how much propaganda is being fed to them by their government. So they said, oh, we don't believe like all our national TV stations and the news that they give us. We just, basically just accept it, but we know that's not, necessarily the truth. Whereas in the U.S., you have so many, like literally millions of Americans that believe everything said on Fox News, everything said on CNN, everything said on MSNBC, and they think that's the clear truth. So it's very, very interesting because if you think about it, I'm not saying like the 96 or whatever percent of Chinese citizens are correct for either, what were the two categories, like being mildly or relatively satisfied or being strongly satisfied with the government. I'm not saying that they're correct, but I'm saying like, okay, you know how the US economy is being destroyed in America? Say those millions of small businesses, now the government was helping. But in concert with that help, that, the lockdowns were even more draconian, I bet, but tens and tens of millions of Americans were uplifted by their government economically. Guess what? They're going to support the very draconian lockdown government. That would happen even in America. So to think otherwise is just simply naive. So, when clearly there's an abundance of evil, not just happening in like Eastern European nations and Asian nations, clearly happening inside Western nations as well, not only allowed to fester, but to multiply in incidences since 2008, then again, that's the height of pious hypocrisy, not to clean up everything that's wrong inside the borders and to start just pointing fingers, because there's that saying, don't throw rocks if you live inside a glass house or something like that. I don't know, that makes sense, right? If you live in a glass house, don't throw rocks. I think they're saying something like that. In any event, so I just wanted to make those two comparisons so people can think, can really maybe start to think for themselves a little, instead of stop, and instead stop accepting everything that's being force-fed down our throats by the mass media. And, in honesty too, I'd rather be openly surveilled like in China versus being secretly surveilled like in many Western nations. So the last thing I want to get to is like this, the most repugnant of all that's accepted in many Western nations, which is the rampant global repulsive pedophilia rings are protected by police and law enforcement all across Western nations, because we have yet to hear about one comparable pedophilia ring of the same size that is constantly being uncovered in Australia, in Belgium, in the United States, where else? It just seems like in so many Western nations, we've yet to hear the same anything even close to that scale in China. Because you know why? Because the CCP, as horrible as everyone thinks they are, would execute anyone found of running such a ring, as I feel they should be executed. And that's probably like one of the few instances where I would support capital punishment. So in other words, Epstein wouldn't have to worry about committing suicide, or some people say Mossad killed him in the New York jail. He would have received a lethal injection right away had he done that in China. Same with Ghislaine Maxwell. She wouldn't have been allowed to roam free and cry like a Karen about being arrested when she was arrested. She would have been arrested right away, and she would have been executed already. Same thing goes for Sarah Kellen. And some of you probably like, who's Sarah Kellen? Exactly, because the West protects these repugnant pedophilia rings. The law enforcement, I'm not saying, Western citizens of those nations. I'm just saying the law enforcement does. And so another prominent recruiter of many of Epstein's victims was Sarah Kellen. And she was fingered by many of Epstein's victims, and she's still roaming around free. Not even arrested, not even questioned. So surely if that had happened in China, Sarah Kellen would have been brought in like months ago. Last year, 2019, she would have been brought in and questioned. And so what happened in Western nations? Well, probably all of you probably have heard of the famous pedophilia ring in Belgium with Marc Dutroux, and the fact that he was a repugnant pedophile rapist who had murdered, I believe, at least 6 young girls, but people think dozens of girls, because in his little cages that he built to imprison these young girls, there were like there's DNA found, they said hundreds of human hairs. So it looked like he was running a pedophilia ring, and the most prominent Belgian politicians and bankers and whoever were coming in to have sex with these little kids. And not only were they abused and tortured, but there was 14 people, arrested after Marc Dutroux was arrested, including prominent Belgian businessman Michael Nijhoul. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, Nihol, Nijhoul. And he stated, quote, this is his quote, he said he had, quote, information about important people in Belgium that could bring the government down, meaning the most powerful politicians in Belgium, at least according to this businessman that was positively identified as running this pedophilia ring, were involved. He said the most prominent Belgian politicians in government were involved in it. And I guarantee you, since Belgium is also a hub for banking, I bet you there are prominent global bankers involved in that too. Because I'd always heard these rumors when I was working in banking that the very top echelons of banking were a bunch of pedophiles. So I guarantee one of the main reasons as well that nobody brings up about Assange is not because he, it's not just jest. It's, part of it is because he released the war crimes committed by the U.S. military of the two Apache helicopters firing and killing Reuters journalists and the innocent civilians that came to rescue the journalists and laughing about it. It wasn't only because of that. I guarantee you he's also being railroaded due to information his organization had that linked the world's richest politicians, businessmen, royal families, and bankers with child sex trafficking rings. Because all across the world, we have this information. Nothing I've said up to this point, with all the crimes of the bankers related to terrorists, North Korea, the most violent, repulsive drug cartels, all this is fact, documented fact, as well as all these pedophilia rings, documented fact. I'll put all the notes in the show notes. There's nothing I'm speculating about. In Australia, too, the federal police arrested nine men in New South Wales. They said with a massive, huge pedophilia ring, they said they obtained tens of thousands of repugnant child pornography images. So tens of thousands, that meant it was going on for years. And also in Western Australia, in Perth, 18 men were arrested in recent years that were running a pedophile ring. And they charged 18 men with 79 sexual offenses, drug, trespass, and animal cruelty allegations as well. The Westminster Dossier in UK, if you don't know what that was, in 1984, an MP, that means a member of parliament, active member of parliament back then, Geoffrey Dickens, gave to then Home Secretary Leon Britton, he said, a dossier that had documented evidence that implicated 40, not 4, 40, 40 personas, 40 MPs being involved in a massive pedophilia, child sex trafficking ring in the UK. And guess what? The Home Secretary said he gave it to Scotland Yard, and Scotland Yard said they lost the entire dossier. So I remember reading a follow-up article, because this happened in 1984, then in 2013, when it came up again, hey, whatever happened to that? Because of course, nothing happened. Because of course, like I said, the law enforcement at the highest level, Scotland Yard, they protect the pedophiles. That's why nothing has happened to Prince Andrew, even though he's been heavily tied to Jeffrey Epstein. They protect them. So stop saying that China is the biggest threat to democracy. You don't think that protection of child sex trafficking rings is not a bigger threat to democracy? You had a prime minister, Ted Heath, known as Ted Heath, who was a documented pedophile. He was your prime minister from 1970 to 1974. So it just goes on and on and on and on and on. And if you don't think there's a connection between pedophilia rings, the New World Order, because I'm telling you, whether you believe it or not, right? Because a lot of people say, okay, this is the only thing that has just a smidge of speculation, right? Because what I've seen in connecting the dots, because you can't connect the dots and say there's documented cases of all the dots being connected when there's not. So this is like when I'm speculating, but it's pretty much, I believe, to be spot on, that there's a connection between these big child sex trafficking rings, the people that want the New World Order, people like Bill Gates that are constantly talking about the need to reduce human population. Like, these people worship dark forces. And I know people are going to say, that sounds crazy, right? But I'll put a little clip at the end. They're everywhere because they're in entertainment. There's clips of, you can go find it online, the Shaquille O'Neal, if you're American, proudly presenting a Freemason ring. You know, anything that's involved in secrecy is something, is an organization that's doing something evil. And in a lot of cases too, here's how people's critical thought processes are so messed up. They'll say something like, if they don't like the Clintons, right? Oh, well, look, the Clinton, everyone knows, they'll say something like the Clinton Foundation was just a front, right? It was a pay to play kind of scheme where it was they took legal bribes for because they exerted a tremendous amount of political influence in the U.S. government. So people bribed them to get certain policies done within the U.S. government. Also, on the darker side, they were accused of their work in Haiti of actually trafficking little children in Haiti. I don't know if that was true or not, but people will bring up these things, right? Say, oh, I can't stand the Clintons because they try to bring up charity. And then people will say, oh, I love Bill Gates though, because look at all the good Bill Gates does with his money, trying to vaccinate the whole world and bring good health to people. And they can't see, right? They can't see that, hey, maybe Bill Gates is not such a good person, and he's trying to hide behind charity, as many people have done, like John Gotti in New York hid behind his charity that I did in New York. Pablo Escobar. Oh, you know what? I don't know. My mind works in funny ways. Just came into my mind. I just remembered the woman I was trying to think of who ran the scam where she bilked people of $900 million, because I told you China executed someone that ran a real estate scam that bilked Chinese people of $800 million. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes, and she ran a company called Theranos, Theranos. I'll put it in the show notes so you can go look at that below. So, you have to think, hey, think about this. People that are enforcing these economic lockdowns, right? What did I say that's causing? That's causing a multiplication right now of desperate parents that are selling their children into sex trafficking rings. Check. Is that something that these people want? Because I just told you there's a link, a very tightly woven link between these pedophile child sex trafficking rings, the people that want the New World Order, the people that want to reduce human population. Even though there's more than enough resources and food, you can go find tons of articles that say we don't have a population problem as of this time. There's more as far as resources and food. If everything was shared and allocated instead of hoarded by billionaires, there would be no problem. And so, again, it's disgusting how influential social media icons and mass media will always try to ridicule the connections that are made, because we have to be smart enough to make these connections between all the things I just spoke about, this systemic banking crime, the child sex trafficking rings, the economic lockdowns, and just realize if you support any of them, that you're on the wrong side of justice, you're on the wrong side of morality, you're on the wrong side of liberty. But I have faith in my audience. I know that overwhelmingly that 99%, hopefully 0.9% of you are on the right side of this argument. So please comment below. Let me know what you think. Let me even know what you think of my connection of the dots. Do you believe that these dots are really, that people are not connecting right now, are really highly connected as I put out there? Yes or no? Tell me what you think in the comments below. And also let me know what you think about my comments in general regarding this video, because I think it's one of the most important videos I've made in the past 4 or 5 weeks or so. So always remain intensely curious. Please like, comment, subscribe below, and as always, remain intensely curious. So long. And please share this video with everyone you know.